when Ricciarda asked me to do this talk, and I saw that that the title of the series is Piano Lesson. Yeah, Piano Lesson. I realized that I have to talk only about the music, the soundtrack that I wrote for Lezioni di Piano, because, well, Piano Lesson, Lezioni di Piano, and there are a lot of things that some things that are not known about the film. So when I was first asked by Jane Campion to write the music for this film in 1992, 25 years ago, the film was called The Piano Lesson. And then somebody discovered, a copyright lawyer discovered that The Piano Lesson was a title of an American play, theater piece, and that the title was copyrighted and that the film couldn't be called The Piano Lesson. And it became The Piano. In English, it's called The Piano. And when Jane Campion discovered that she couldn't use The Piano Lesson as the title, she said, well, I'm going to call it something else with a line from Emily Dickinson or Thomas Hood or whatever. And I said, well, from my point of view as a composer, the whole point about this soundtrack is that it's written about the piano, about a woman who uses the piano as a means of communication. You know, all my thinking has to do with the piano, and to call this film something that doesn't have the piano in the title is kind of stupid. So the fact that the film in England and maybe everywhere else apart from Italy and I think France, La Leçon de Piano, is because of me, which is kind of nice. I could sit here and talk for an hour, and I could tell you a lot of stuff about the background to the soundtrack to the piano, the writing of the soundtrack to the piano. The pre-life of the music, the life of the music in the film, and the life of the music after the film. And you will sit there and say, well, if Michael Nyman had given us the opportunity to ask a question, the answers would not have been part of this hour of talking. So I'm very happy to do this talk as a dialogue if you have questions about the piano that you want me to answer. But just a bit of background. I was in my house in London in 1991, I guess, and I had a phone call from Jane Campion, who explained to me that she was making a film called The Piano Lesson, and that she would like me to write the soundtrack. And I was sort of slightly disrespectful, because one of the things in English culture that I don't think you would understand here is the importance of Australian soap operas. So I've done some of my best composing by watching Australian soap operas, especially Neighbours. And so I was kind of rather frivolous with Jane, and I said, oh, that's really good. I would like to do an Australian film. I've always wanted to write music for an Australian soap opera. So that didn't go down very well. And you know, if somebody calls you on the phone and says, Michael, I want you to write the music for this film, you either say yes, or you say, send me the script, or you say, why me? So I kind of said all three, and the answer to the why question was very interesting. And she said that she'd done a lot of research, she'd listened to music by a lot of other composers, kind of well-known soundtrack composers, and she, after listening to all this music and listening to my music, she'd chosen me, so there's another why question. And the answer was that she seemed to find in my music the ability in a very short space of time to create a musical idea, to create an atmosphere, to create a mood, to create an emotion. And then I seemed to be able to do it quickly and effectively and strongly. And I thought, fine. So she must have been familiar with the work that I'd done with Peter Greenaway, because these were the kind of major soundtracks of mine that she would have listened to. And then there was a sort of slight pause in the conversation, and you know, when I was congratulating myself on, you know, being this composer who can write this kind of music that she obviously liked, and she said, but I don't want any of that Greenaway shit. So I thought, okay, this is very interesting. So she's listened to all the Greenaway soundtracks, discovered that I have the ability to do what she needs in a soundtrack composer, but the style and subject of my music, how I express myself in the Greenaway films, which is how I express myself in every piece of music that I write, whether it's an opera, string quartet, or whatever, was something that she rejected. So I thought this was disturbing, but clever. So it then meant that for me to write the soundtrack for the piano, I, in a way, had to reinvent myself as a composer, and not be able to just continue writing what I already had been writing for 15 years, so not to continue to reproduce Michael Nyman. So that was interesting, and I read. So she did, in fact, send me she sent me the script, and I read the first 2 pages of the script, and the descriptive language of the arrival of Ada, the Holly Hunter character, on the beach in New Zealand. I mean, it was so visceral and visual that I kind of probably phoned her or wrote to her after 10 minutes and said, yes, I want to do this. And then there's the question of, most films don't need soundtracks. The Piano is a film that obviously did need a soundtrack because the main character not only plays the piano, which is important in itself, so that's the source of music in the first place, but uses the piano as I say, her means of emotional expression, verbal expression, non-verbal expression, etc., etc. So this was something that I'd never been confronted with as a soundtrack composer. When I wrote music for the Greenaway films, I wrote music according to certain structures, to certain categories, to certain ideas, to certain modes of intellectual expression. I mean, since there is no emotion in a Greenaway film except that which is contained in the music, he never said to me, you know, I have this scene where there's this kind of relationship between these two characters and what is happening emotionally needs to be expressed in the music. So there were basic categories. So the draftsman's contract, I don't know, if you haven't seen the film, there's a draftsman, there's a painter who goes to a house in the English countryside and is commissioned to make 12 drawings of different aspects of the house, different positions of the house and the garden. And Greenaway's instruction to me was that each drawing, the drawings were made at different times of the day, that each drawing should have a piece of music attached to it, so that every time we saw the drawing and we heard the piece of music that was attached to it, we could immediately identify which part of the house was being drawn. So this is the kind of structural process that I find very exciting as a composer. I don't really find it exciting to have a demand of expressing this emotion or that emotion, because I find that if I have an abstract process to compose to, the kind of musical material that I seem to invent comes with its own emotional language. So that is what I spent the previous kind of 10 years doing with Peter Greenaway. So here I was with Jane's film, confronted with music that was in the foreground of the film and music that was a mode of expression for the main character. And I read the script and I sat down with Jane and I asked the most intelligent question and useful question that I've ever asked in my life, which was, we would go through the script and Jane would say, yes, at this point, when Holly Hunter is doing something, is playing the piano basically, I would like you to write a piece of music. And so my question was, a very simple question, but very bright. I was bright in those days. If the Holly Hunter character could speak at this point, what would she be saying? So I then gathered together this kind of unwritten script of emotions that would be attached to each piece of music that I had to write. But then, again, in a way that I never had to do with Peter Greenaway, with Greenaway, the characters were not really characters, they were not really human beings, they were actors who spoke Peter Greenaway scripts, which is very different from kind of self-expression. And with the Holly Hunter character, I realized that if she was a pianist and if she expressed herself in music, so playing the piano, music was her voice, I had to discover her voice. So it's not just a case of giving her any kind of music as I would have done with Peter Greenaway. It had to be something that specifically illuminated her character, illuminated her emotions, and more importantly, did it in such a way that was comprehensible, that could have been comprehensible in the middle of the 19th century, which is the period in which this film was set, which is kind of difficult because I'm a kind of post-experimental minimalist composer living in England in like 1991, 1992. I'm a man. I'm a composer who uses structures and repetition and formulae to manufacture music, rather than to use music as either a means of self-expression or as a means of somebody else expressing themselves through music. So I then had to create something that wasn't in the script. I had to create Ada, Holly Hunter, as a pianist composer. And as a pianist composer who could have lived in the middle of the 19th century in Scotland. And she had to be a pianist composer because her voice had to be the voice that she composed rather than the voice that she performed. So it would have been very easy for me to take a piece of Schumann and to ask Holly Hunter to play it, but that would have been the equivalent of giving her a John Keats poem, and that would be her way of expressing herself. So I had to create Holly Hunter, Ada, the composer. So I thought, okay, she is a composer who lived in Edinburgh, and she is a pianist who would have played in bourgeois salons or whatever, and she would have had a certain amount of kind of pianistic technique, but not a lot. And also the other factor, determining factor, was that I asked Holly Hunter to. So Holly Hunter was a pianist. She'd played the piano when she was a teenager, and then she stopped playing, and then in her 40s she just got in a new relationship, and for some reason she asked her boyfriend, or suggested to the boyfriend, that they buy a piano. So she started playing the piano again, and then she got hold of a copy of the script of the piano and decided that she had to play the part. And Holly Hunter was not on a short list for that part. She was not on a long list. This is a very surprising fact, that Jane's original choice for an actress to play Ada was Angelica Houston. Just think about it. So Holly got hold of a copy of the script, and she hustled and persuaded Jane to give her the part. So she got the part. It was then of some interest to me, since I knew that Holly would play the piano herself, to find out what sort of pianist she was. So she sent me a cassette, and I actually have this. I should have brought it with me. I still have this cassette in my house across the park here. And she played Bach two-part inventions and some other things. And I kind of realized very, very early on that, let's say, I mean, her technique was okay, but that she didn't play fast music very well, and she did play slow, poetic, romantic music quite well. So I'm a composer who does a lot of fast music. So I thought, not only can I not write Greenaway style music, but I can't write Nyman style music with fast articulation, etc., etc. So that was another element that I had to assimilate into this building up of Holly Hunter as a composer, Ada as a composer. And then I thought that she lived in Edinburgh, and that it's possible that if she'd been an amateur composer, that her source material could have been Scottish popular music. I had to have a starting point somehow. So in my kind of biographical portrait of this character, I'd already decided, for different reasons, that she was a woman who played slow music rather expressively, and that I had decided that her music, the character of music, that Holly Hunter, the composer, would be a composer whose source material was Scottish popular music. So, having been an academic, I went to the London University Music Library, and I found a book of 19th century transcriptions, 19th century transcriptions of Scottish popular music, maybe Scottish folk music, and I found a lot of tunes. I mean, this was a big, thick book, and I mean, one of the most exciting things about being a composer and doing research is discovering that other music exists beyond, prior to my imagination, that I can use as a source material for a piece that I then call a piece of music by Michael Nyman. So, whether it's Mozart or Schumann or whatever, there's always a good musical or contextual reason for using found music. And so I copied down all these Scottish popular songs, and then started transforming them into the soundtrack that is familiar to all of you and very familiar to me, and became familiar to Holly Hunter. So the main, so this piece, was written like, was transcribed in this book of that I found, printed book, like a religious hymn. So I then had to kind of create a kind of musical style for her that wasn't like a kind of religious song. And in doing so, so I not only created Ada as a composer, but I sort of recreated me, Michael Nyman, as a composer, and wrote music that that was very suitable for Holly, that seemed to be suitable for for the film and for the director and everyone who worked on the film, but that seemed to be a big departure for me from the music that I was familiar with as a composer, which is the kind of music that I wrote for the Greenaway films. And the other thing that I haven't mentioned is, so we have to kind of, there are certain things that happen in our lives that appear to be normal. So if you think of architectural spaces, you think this building has always been there. I can't imagine this space without this building. I can't imagine the space where the Piccolo Teatro is without the Piccolo Teatro. But, you know, once upon a time, I guess there was another building there, or there was an empty field, and what appears to be acceptable and totally normal at one time didn't exist. And the soundtrack for the piano has become so famous in its own right and as part of the film that it's kind of impossible, I think, for you, I mean, people that have become familiar with the music through the film, to imagine a time when that music didn't exist. So that theme, which apparently, you know, is very familiar to a lot of people and has a sort of emotional importance in different ways for different people at different times. You know, there was a period when that didn't exist. And to people who only know, or who know the soundtrack through the film, what I also have to say is that there was a time when the film didn't exist. So there's obviously a time when the film didn't exist and the combination of music and film did not exist. And the film did not exist at the time that I wrote the music. So what appears to be this kind of wonderful fusion of music and images, of narrative and action and whatever, where the music appears to be, seems to be the most appropriate, except to people who hate the soundtrack, and that's another thing. So there are a lot of people who think the soundtrack is totally inappropriate. So everyone else who kind of accepts that mix of soundtrack and film assume that the film had been made, the film was shown to the composer sat down and responded in some way with instructions from the director to what I saw, but basically there was just a huge blank. There was a script which didn't really tell me very much, and there was a deadline and the deadline was that Holly Hunter was going to play the music on screen. So during the shoot, everything that Holly plays was played live. So that then meant that she had to have time to learn to play the music before the film was shot. It then meant that I, as the composer, had to write the music sufficiently in advance of her to be able to learn it, etc., so she could play it on screen, and for her to appear that she was playing comfortably music that she had written herself, the character. So this is the blank space where the film didn't exist, and I had no idea what the film would look like. There were no production stills. I wasn't on location. There was also, I also had no sense of the character. I had no sense how Holly Hunter would play that character, how Jane would direct her, how she would look. I'd seen Holly Hunter once in broadcast news, where she played a kind of contemporary character in a newsroom. So what I find still surprising is that with a very, very minimum amount of information, I seem to have created the soundtrack which seems to be the inevitable consequence of that film, and that the film is the inevitable consequence of the soundtrack that I wrote without seeing a single frame of the film, without seeing any of the acting, without seeing any of the lighting, without seeing any of the locations, without seeing any of the costumes. I don't know, composers here like Ludovico, who's been through this whole thing many times, to writing a soundtrack is guesswork. You know, the director will explain something, they know nothing about music, and the director doesn't know what he or she wants, because even I or Ludovico as a composer don't know how we would express their desires or their requirements in music. You know, because the nice thing about being a composer is you start sometimes with a completely blank page and you don't know what the first sound is going to be. I mean, even when I found that melody, I had no idea that that kind of fast stuff in the left hand would be part of the presentation of that theme. So for the director to be able to direct the composer into making specific musical choices is sometimes humorous, sometimes a total nightmare, and can quite often, after 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, lead to a total breakdown of communication or total breakdown of non-communication, and the director is looking for the next composer. And giving the same instructions to another composer, and the other composer fulfilling those instructions, or the director being forced to accept the other composer's solutions to the problem because there's a deadline. There are a lot of things I have a lot of stories. So that's basically, and the other. So that's basically the story. So, I mean, just as a kind of minor detail, the other thing that composers don't do. If composers did it, then we would all be more successful more of the time, and we'd all live in much bigger houses, is that you can't manufacture a hit. You know, whether as a songwriter or as an instrumental composer or a soundtrack composer. So basically, you do the job that is asked of you. So that piece of music, which has become some sort of hit, if you look at my notes, you'd see Q number 2, M2, Ada expresses something or other, and I would take my Scottish theme and present it in that way. Then I would fax it, if you must remember faxes. I would then fax it to Holly. She had a music teacher called Margie Balter in LA, so Margie would teach you how to play it. Hollywood learn it with a certain amount of skill and a certain amount of passion, and kind of made it her own. And then, you know, once I finished that piece, I would move on to the next cue, which did something else. So the process of making this music is kind of mechanistic, and I didn't look at this piece and think, my God, everyone is going to love this piece. It's really going to dominate the film. It's really going to win this award. And one of the things that we have to do as composers while we're still working on the soundtrack is to make a soundtrack album. And so basically you have to find a record company who want to release the soundtrack album. So I found a record label, I think they were actually called Milan Records. Yeah, so I got the guy from Milan Records. We screened the film for him. It had no music. Oh, it did have music. No, it did have music. And he looked at this film and he said, who is going to want to watch this film where this aggressive husband cuts off the finger of his wife? And he said, I will make you an offer, and a very kind of low offer for this soundtrack album. And me being, you know, the English boy said, so if Sam Neill had not cut off the finger of Holly Hunter, would you have given me more money for this album? So we said goodbye. We said goodbye to Dominique from Milan Records, and then I signed another deal. But at that point, nobody knew that the film was going to take off in the way it did, and it partly has to do with the quality of the film and the performances, partly has to do with the quality of the music, but also has to do, I think, with a certain moment in history when the kind of relationship issues that were dealt with in that film, especially kind of women's issues, were at a moment when they seemed to need to be represented by this kind of film. And if the film had been made 5 years later, or 10 years later, or now, I wonder whether, you know, our sensibilities have changed. We would have looked at it very differently. So I'm very happy that it happened when it did happen. Thank you. I think it's time to go and hear those kids play the 50 toy pianos.